Good morning. It's good to see you all here this morning in person or online. Welcome to the 2026 Friesen Lectures here at Canadian Mennonite University. The John and Margaret Friesen Lectures were established in 2002 by Dr. Abraham Friesen, Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Dr. Friesen grew up here in Manitoba. He earned his BA from the University of Manitoba before going on to do an MA and PhD at Stanford University. He chose the name John and Margaret Friesen to honor his older brother and sister-in-law. John and Margaret made a lasting impression on younger Abe. When Abe was attending university, he really connected with his older brother. Abe wrote, "For about 3 years, while an impoverished student attending the University of Manitoba, they took me into their home, treating me as one of their own. I shall never forget their generosity to me, their love and their acceptance. Marge, with 5 children of her own, all of whom I regard as younger siblings, took me in, even though she did not have to. But she did so in a most loving manner. Later, she did the same thing for our son, during his first year at University of Manitoba. Dr. Abe Friesen was the inaugural speaker in 2002 and focused on Mennonites in Russia, Ukraine during World War I. The Friesen lectures are co-sponsored by the Center for Mennonite Brethren Studies, Mennonite Heritage Archives, and Canadian Mennonite University. The current committee is made up of Paul Dirksen, Carl Koop, Karina Gilardo, and myself, Conrad Stace. CMU is a busy campus. In addition to the Friesen lectures, other upcoming events at CMU include Discovery Day, What is Life Like at CMU on February the 2nd. The current exhibit at the Mennonite Heritage Center Gallery is The Land Remembers, Palestine, Courage, Resilience, Resistance, and runs until February 28th. And February 9th to 10th is the Renew Pastors Conference here at CMU. You can find out more about these events on cmu.ca/events. The Friesen Lectures has been a venue that has featured a wide variety of speakers and topics. Our speakers have transported us through Switzerland and Guatemala, Ukraine and Zimbabwe, Paraguay and Holland. Together we have pondered the intersection of animals and the divine, the art of writing, identity, sacred spaces, and more. We're thankful to Dr. Friesen and his family for supporting the exploration of Mennonite history in this way at Canadian Mennonite University. Lectures like these help make research and knowledge accessible to a wider audience. To introduce our speaker today, I'd like to invite Dr. Paul Dirksen to the front.
Thank you, Conrad. It's my pleasure to introduce this year's Friesen lecturer, Dr. Mark Jansen, Professor of History at Bethel College in North Newton, Kansas. Professor Jansen, who is a native of Nebraska, has lived and worked extensively in Europe. From 1988 to 91, he studied theology at Humboldt University in East Berlin as part of the Mennonite Central Committee East Europe Study Service Program. And from 1993 to 96, he worked as the resource development for Bread of Life in Belgrade, Serbia, and as a regional coordinator for MCC. Mark is an accomplished author and editor with an impressive publication record. I'll mention just a few highlights from a much longer list. He has edited, for example, 2 volumes of collected research I want to mention. First one, European Mennonites and the Challenge of Modernity Over 5 Centuries, Contributors, Detractors, and Adapters. And then more recently, European Mennonites and the Holocaust with the University of Toronto Press. He's also the author of the fascinating book, Mennonite German Soldiers, Nation, Religion, and Family in the Prussian East, 1772 to 1880. I've used Mark's material from both his edited and authored publications in my own teaching here at CMU. The 2-part lecture series that Professor Jansen will present is titled overall, The Shifting National Identities of Mennonites in Polish-German Lands. This morning's lecture is titled, Changing Old Martyrs for New in 19th Century Prussia. Tonight's lecture, 7 o'clock, same place here, is titled, So Maybe We Were All Polish. So I'd like to now welcome Professor Mark Jansen and give him the floor for his lecture. Thank you.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you all for coming, and I want to thank the committee for inviting me and for all the hospitality that I have experienced here. And it's just been really good to be here and to be with you. Now, my friends, we will know that the times are dire if someone reprints Anabaptist martyr stories updated with accounts of persecution that happen in Winnipeg in 2026. Don't think we're there yet. But such reproductions have been a long-standing Mennonite cultural practice to fortify the faith in the face of persecution or temptation. Or to say it in another key, in the face of Satan's roaring like a lion, or the seductions of Satan's demons. The Dutch Martyr's Mirror, of course, stands at the end of a 100-year publishing run of various editions in the Netherlands that stretched from the time of Menno Simons to 1685. The editor of the Martyr's Mirror, in its final form, Tieleman van Braght, worried that his own time without persecution was more dangerous than the earlier bloody days when Satan assaulted the faithful openly. In these latter days, he wrote, quote, "The devil came at night or at dusk in an unrecognized but nonetheless pleasing form." The first German translation of the Martyr's Mirror was published in 1749 in British North America in Penn's colony, and is still available today from bookstores that cater to conservative Mennonite and Amish groups. A German Aussiedler publisher just released a new translation, so interest in this book remains strong among more conservative German-speaking Mennonites. The impetus for this first translation was the fear of persecution for being non-resistant in Pennsylvania during King George's War, which in Europe is known as the War of Austrian Succession. By 1780, a reprint of this German translation was made in the Palatinate back in Germany, promoted mostly by the Amish there, but read by Mennonites as well. And then 2 years later, in Gdansk, or Danzig, Poland, well, it's on, but it's not working. It was working earlier.
It's changing here, but not on the screen.
There we go. Did you do that or did I? There we go. Okay, now we're on track. So, reprint of the Martyr's Mirror in Germany in 1780, 1782, Isaac van Duren compiled a collection of martyr stories for Mennonites in Gdansk. He was a preacher there. He'd been ordained there in 1775 in one of the Gdansk congregations, and then he got the manuscript published in 1787, and his book is titled The History of the Martyrs, or A Short Historical Report of the Persecution of the Mennonites. Now, starting in 1772, Gdansk had become completely surrounded by the Kingdom of Prussia, and I think that's why he wrote this book. Van Duren added contemporary stories of suffering and resistance, creating an updated take on martyrs. Not entirely 80 years later, in 1863, Mennonites in the Mleczna colony in Imperial Russia reprinted this book because, as the preface stated, so little literature was available in German to praise and honor God through the memories of those who had sealed the truth with their blood. The publisher's prayer was that reading this book would be better than reading, quote, all the other sanctimonious new books that are decorated with lofty, learned, and elegant words, which is what worldly people with secular education long to hear. Now I feel like we should hope we're not endangered with learned eloquence this morning. We'll see how that goes. That book is here, so it's in the library. A third edition was reprinted here in Winnipeg in 1939 by the Mennonite congregations of Manitoba because the first two editions, they said, were long out of print, and current times, according to the preface, called for reading material that would deepen the faith and be more useful than some of the other material being disseminated, leaving the reader to draw their own conclusions about what dangerous influences were circulating in Winnipeg in the 1930s. That edition is up here as well. And then a fourth edition, also up here, was printed in 1973 in Guatemala, Mexico. That's 201 years earlier than the original manuscript had been compiled. So you have all three volumes up here on display. This image is from the original, oldest one from the collection at Bethel. Now, I'm pretty sure that nothing I have ever written will be republished over the next 200 years in 4 different countries. So now we have to go back to Gdansk and figure out what was going on and why this was written and what's so powerful about it. So Gdansk, or Danzig, is a port city at the mouth of the Vistula River in northern Poland. It was a key harbor at the Polish end of a very lucrative Dutch-Polish trade route. And it was run by wealthy merchants, Lutherans, who ran the town, and they had to balance their relationships with Catholic bishops, with the Polish king, and with ambitious guild members. And in 1772, 10 years before Van Buren compiled his collection of martyr stories, Poland's neighbors, as you can see on the map here, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, took parts of the country in what was later called the First Partition of Poland. Danzig remained attached to Poland, but Prussia was able to cut it off from the rest of the country and connected its own territory of Ducal Prussia with Pomerania, renaming this new territory West Prussia and Ducal Prussia as East Prussia. And then Prussia introduced a tough regiment of custom duties, or tariffs, that ran from 30 to 50% on Gdansk. And there's just an article about that in the last issue of Preservings. And then in 1793, Prussia annexed Gdansk outright, which ended any worrying about tariffs. But it introduced some other concerns for Danzigers and Mennonites. Now, in addition to being a preacher, Isaac van Buren was a cloth dyer and a weaver living in the Gdansk suburbs until his death in 1800. In those days, there were 2 branches of Mennonites in Poland, the minority Friesians, who were a little more relaxed about church discipline, and the majority Flemish, who were a little stricter. Van Buren was a preacher in the Friesian branch. And presumably when writing his book, his business was suffering the ill effects of these high tariffs. But he doesn't talk about that at all. What he talks about is a different problem with the Prussians. He had, in fact, been born and lived the first 7 years of his life in Königsberg, in Ducal Prussia. And then as a 7-year-old boy, he was expelled, and he would have undoubtedly recalled this expulsion in 1732 by the King Frederick William I of Prussia, who could not tolerate the Mennonite principle of non-resistance and non-participation in his beloved Prussian military. As Van Buren recounted in his book, and it's been written about elsewhere, Frederick William I's father, Frederick I, in 1711, had invited expelled Swiss Mennonites to his lands, but they preferred to go to Pennsylvania. Instead, Frisian Mennonites from the Vistula Valley, where land was less plentiful, took up the king on his offer. Frederick was primarily interested in settlers and taxpayers after the plague had depopulated villages in the area of Tilsit along the border to Lithuania. But after his death in 1713, his son, Frederick William I, came to the throne, and he was obsessed with soldiers and didn't care about budgets and taxpayers. In 1723, 2 years before Van Buren was born, Prussian recruiters raided the Mennonite settlements in Ducal Prussia, kidnapping 6 Mennonites amidst a fair amount of property damage and violence that Van Buren characterized as torture. Particularly problematic was the fact that at least 2 of these 6 men were Lutheran converts who had joined the Mennonite migration from Poland to Ducal Prussia in 1711 as farmhands. And then during a period of revival in 1717, they joined the Mennonite congregation and likely married Mennonite wives. The Prussian government, however, refused to acknowledge their conversion as legitimate and denied that they should be exempted from the military as Mennonites. After some additional torture and abuse, which included a trip to Potsdam near Berlin to be inspected by the king personally, all were released except for one guy who had agreed to serve in the military and thereby abandoned the Mennonite faith. The king noted, "I cannot abide such useless worms who refuse to serve." And he ordered the expulsion of all 600 Mennonites in rural villages in Ducal Prussia. They returned to Poland, founding the congregation of Trogheim Weide south of Marienburg. A few years later, a Prussian nobleman who had noticed the high rents Mennonites were paying along the Vistula River arranged for some 40 families who had not found affordable land in Poland to return to the Tilsit area. Yet the king's disdain remained, and when in 1732 his officials were able to arrange a large-scale transfer of Protestants from Catholic Salzburg in Austria to his ducal Prussian territory, he ordered all Mennonites expelled, since he now had an adequate number of settlers. This round of expulsion included the von Duren family in Königsberg and 7-year-old Isaac. Although both the Königsberg and rural Tilsit congregations were reestablished, the Königsberg congregation already just 7 months later, Isaac von Duren remained living outside the city walls of Gdansk. Of the two main groups of Mennonites in Poland, von Duren's Friesians made some allowances for marriages between Mennonites and non-Mennonites, while the Flemish did not. This stance of openness to converts in marriage was one aspect of what got von Duren expelled from Prussia. As he wrote his History of the Martyrs, the Prussians were at the gate. They had indeed already in 1772 annexed Polish territory where half a dozen Frisian congregations resided. As a result, every congregation except one aligned their church discipline policies with Flemish practices and banned members who married outside the faith in order to prevent future conflicts with an intolerant Prussian state. The lone holdout, the Orlauferfelde congregation, finally joined this policy a few decades later. Thus, von Duren had multiple reasons, tariffs, torture, expulsion, impressment into the military, to fear the Prussians and to highlight Mennonite practices of suffering, martyrdom, and flight. He exhorted his readers as children of God to remain faithful to the teachings of Jesus. Many others agreed with him that their way of life was under threat, in part because the new government made it impossible for Mennonites to purchase real estate from non-Mennonites. Already the year after his book was published, over 200 families left the area to settle in the Russian Empire in what became known as Chortitza Colony. Now, while Frisian congregations had borne the brunt of Prussian policies on mixed marriages, all Mennonites had to respond to the Prussian threat of military service and restrictions on their religious freedoms. They were more united in meeting this challenge than on marriage issues. On September 13, 1772, the Prussian government took possession of Royal Prussian territory along the Vistula that stretched from Gdansk to Torun. 2 weeks later, on September 27, 1772, Mennonite delegates were among the representatives of the Royal Prussian notables who pledged fealty to their new Prussian king at a homage ceremony held at the Marburg Castle, the former headquarters of the Teutonic Knights, located only 8 kilometers from the Heubuden church building, the nearest Mennonite congregation. In this flat landscape, the tower of the castle was visible from the church in clear weather in winter when the leaves were off the trees. At the ceremony, Mennonites gave officials a copy of their Royal Polish Charter of Privileges that outlined their rights and freedoms and asked for the Prussian king to confirm the same. Freedom from military recruitment and registration was 5th on the list of 9 items that they enumerated for inclusion. And then they thought, how can we improve the odds of success for this request? So they provided a gift to the royal kitchen of 2 oxen, 400 pounds of butter, 20 cheeses, 50 pairs of chicken, and 50 pairs of ducks. So the picture here is of the refectory, the dining room of the monastery where the knights who were monks were eating. That room seats about 400 people. There was another smaller refectory that seated maybe another 30, 40 people. So Mennonites gave about a pound of butter apiece for this feast, plus a bunch of the meat. And yeah, that kind of worked. So the king said, you can stay out of the military, but you're going to have to start paying a new fee for this privilege. So starting in 1773, they're paying a communal tax that they have to collect together of 5,000 Reichstaler. And they had to pay the tax as a group, and they developed a mechanism to make sure that everyone paid their fare. The government had suggested they should just charge each adult male 1 Reichstaler. But Mennonite leadership developed their own layered system of self-taxation that included an annual set fee for every male older than 16, a smaller fee for every female older than 16, and then a fee for people who owned agricultural land. And we have accounts of how they set that system up in the 1770s. And then we have two tables that show the math from 1828 and 1840. In each case, they're careful to add up to 5,000. So that's 5113, your total. And there they're added up to 5158. And on the left always, you have the name of the congregation, and then the columns show you how many males, how many females, and how much land. So it's kind of like an early spreadsheet to make sure all the Mennonites are paying their fair share. This tax was originally designated to pay for the middle school education of Polish nobles' sons to become military officers in the Prussian army. It took them a couple years to get recruiting going for this school. So the first 2 years when the school wasn't running, they diverted the tax money to build a school building. And so, well, there we go. You can see this cadet academy. You've got the architectural drawing from the archives in Berlin, and then you can see it as it appears in the streets today in Chełmno, Poland. So we paid for this. You think of that as Mennonite architecture? This annual collection of a self-imposed tax, what Mennonites called cadet money, changed their society along the Vistula River in many ways. Leadership now met on a regular basis to run this tax program. They had a reliable way to raise substantial sums of money, a method they used to fund other community-wide political endeavors, such as sending delegations to the king or supplying gifts, which maybe we should call bribes, to the Prussian government. The requirement on members to pay their share was backed by the law, so that if requested, the funds could be gathered in the same way back taxes were collected, confiscations and auctions. Mennonites did not resort to this tactic, as far as I know, but in some cases, if Mennonites refused to pay, the ban was applied to them, and then they were sent to the military. The leadership's authority increased and became more centralized. It also made it possible for the community to act with speed and unity when their freedoms were threatened. An important example of this happened in 1806, during Napoleonic Wars, when Prussia declared war on France without first securing any allies. And the result was a rapid and catastrophic defeat of both main Prussian armies on a single day, October 14. The road to Berlin lay open. The royal family and the government fled east. Mennonites worried that renewed pressure would come out of this on their military exemption. And they also knew, of course, that those lost battles had created many new Prussian war widows and orphans. So 2 weeks after those battles, on October 28, um, 1806, they gathered on a farmstead of Ehrenvolke near Marienburg, and they decided to raise a six-fold sum. Take your taxes times 6. Then they were going to give a voluntary patriotic contribution to the Royal Fund for War Widows and Orphans. Now, in addition, of course, to helping out the victims of war, everyone knew that the donations to this fund were also recognized as the best way to stay out of military service. So, for example, if you wanted to become a citizen of the city of Gdansk and have the right to reside there, you had to pay into this War Widows and Orphans Fund, because becoming a citizen of Gdansk at that time kept you out of the military. As Johann Donner, the elder of the Oberlaufer Felde congregation, noted, this gift kept us so completely in the good graces of the king that he preserved our freedom of conscience during the terrible storms of war. Now, the leaders in the October meeting had not really worked out when is the money due and how do we deliver it. That all got settled by a random chance encounter of a Mennonite deacon on November 8, whose name was Abraham Nickel. And he met in the city of Gdansk, or Gdansk, with a Prussian general. Nickel was from the Mennonite congregation in Schönsee, which is just south of Gdansk, and he happened to strike up a conversation in town with this general from Kokritz. Now, as it turns out, von Kokritz was the general in charge of kind of the eyes and ears of the king. What are the people thinking? Nickel told him about this decision to make a donation, and the general said, hey, why don't you write that up and I'll get it to the king and we'll see if we can get you an audience. So Nickel writes up that we have this gift that was intended for the War Widows and Orphans Fund, but you, O king, can do whatever you want with it. So the original intent of the gift got a little muddled because the deacon wasn't used to dealing with kings. Usually elders did that. But he did get an audience with the king, and the king told him, this is where you bring the money and this is the date that it's due. And then the process went back to where it belonged with the elders and Elder Cornelius Warkentien of the Rozenort congregation, who's better known in Mennonite history for having assisted in the organization of the Flemish congregation in Kortitsa colony. He went and led the Mennonite delegation that delivered this money to the royal treasury in November and December of 1806. Now, we're going to come back and talk about that payment at the very end, so don't forget about Deacon Abram Nickel. The money did keep Mennonites out of the draft. They ran into more trouble in the aftermath of the failed 1812 invasion of Russia. In 1813, as stragglers were coming back and the Russians were advancing, there was a threat to their military service. They made payments to stay out of it. But this time when the militia was supposed to muster, angry neighbors dragged Mennonite youth to the mustering points. Sometimes they would beat them along the way, or they would grab their fathers and throw them in jail because they wouldn't let their sons go to mustering. So no one was killed, but the pressure of those days must have seemed like a version of Prussian martyrdom to some. Now, back to Isaac van Duren, the author of the History of the Martyrs we looked at initially. He died in 1800, and so he missed out on the drama and violence of the Napoleonic Wars. But he would have experienced the erasure of Poland from the map. For Mennonites who were born and raised and educated in Prussia, new sensibilities around Mennonite and national identities arose. They didn't remember Poland at all. Frederick II, the Prussian king who received the Mennonites' homage and their butter in 1772, had promised them eternal freedom from military service. But in 1848, a revolution in all the German lands challenged the authority of kings, and internally, some Mennonites were wondering if their former principle of living separate from society was still a good idea. The Mennonites' military exemption was briefly revoked and then restored during the course of the 1848 revolutions, but then it remained publicly challenged and debated throughout the 1850s and 1860s. Dr. Wilhelm Monhart emerged in this context as a new voice among Mennonites on martyrs. He was born in 1831 in Friedrichstadt in Schleswig, northern Germany. His father Jacob was a Mennonite pastor there, who in 1836 moved his young family to Gdansk to take up the pastorate of the Danzig Mennonite Church. Young William's interests were more in mythology and folk tales than Mennonite theology. When the war broke out between the German states and Denmark in 1848, he followed the battles closely. A Danish friend justified Denmark's possession of Schleswig with antiquity and the ongoing presence of Norse mythology in that land. Looking for counter-arguments, that summer, William read Jakob Grimm, of Grimm Brothers fame, a book that he had written in 1835, German Mythology, which posited that German peasants, as the keepers of an ancient Germanic religious sensibility that bound all Germans together as an ageless German nation, had long lived in the land and justified German control. While reading this book under the apple tree in his parents' backyard, William experienced Grimm's claim as a type of religious conversion experience that set him on his life's goal. Suddenly he saw, quote, that it would be a national service to collect and evaluate oral traditions of every kind as documents of the national origins, end quote. Researching German mythology became his life's passion. His own physical ailments kept him from serving in the military, a fact he lamented in a poem that he wrote at age 17 during the fighting in 1848, quote, that I cannot take up the deadly challenge given by the northern pirates, and am hindered by a weakness, bends me low in my inmost thoughts. He finished his doctoral studies in 1853, becoming the first German Mennonite to earn a doctorate and stay in the church. He dedicated his dissertation to Jacob Grimm and worked as the editor of the Journal for German Folklore and Folkways for the rest of the 1850s, along with doing some sessional work at the University of Berlin. In the early 1860s, he moved back to Gdansk. After a particularly raucous call in 1861 in the Prussian parliament to force Mennonites to finally serve in the military, church leadership commissioned him to write a defense of their military exemption to be distributed to government officials. And he did that in a book entitled The Military Service Exemption of the Mennonites of Provincial Prussia. Yet he wrote this book on commission, not out of personal conviction. He personally thought, already since 1848, that Prussian Mennonites should participate in the military in the defense of the German homeland. For those with tender consciences, he thought serving as a medic would be a good solution. Other Mennonites, in his opinion, might well serve as regular soldiers. His ideas were expressed openly in 1868 after the draft was imposed on Mennonites in East and West Prussia. Monhart wrote a series of articles arguing the acceptance of military service in the main Mennonite newspaper of the time, the Mennonitische Blätter, or Mennonite Journal, founded and published by his father. In his January 1869 article, he listed ways Jesus approved of the military, from his amiable conversation with the centurion of Capernaum to his arming of his own disciples with swords. He then adopted elements of Martin Luther's two kingdom theology and argued that Jesus' command to love our enemies in our personal lives must be set aside when we are engaged in self-defense, which can, in some circumstances, of course, include collective self-defense with our neighbors of our loved ones in warfare. He argued that such defense is an obligation of Christians and best managed by the state, which will be responsible for the legality and the moral rectitude of the decisions that follow. At this juncture in his argument, Wilhelm Monhart introduced a new version of appropriate martyrdom for Mennonites to consider. He cited the example of Arnold of Winkelried in 1386 at the Battle of Sembach. Winkelried reportedly flung his body on the Austrian pikes, opening up a hole in their line and making a Swiss victory and ultimately Swiss independence possible. In a setting where an outside attack threatens lives, the government is required to defend its citizens, who in turn have an obligation to assist in these defensive measures. Jesus, Monhart argued, supported such action with his admonition in John 15:13, which reads, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down his life for his friends." Leaving the theological issues aside, there are several historical points to mention here. Winkelried's name is first connected with the Battle of Sembach only in the 16th century, over 100 years after his death, in what appears to be an early case of national myth-making to create a unified Swiss character. After the Swiss Civil War of 1847, that created a strong central Swiss government, Winkelried's story was popularized everywhere in history books and in paintings like the one on the screen to evoke a new style of citizen-driven Swiss nationalism. Thus, Monhart substituted an imaginary nationalist martyr for real Anabaptist martyrs, including the erasure of the suffering and commitments of other Prussian Mennonites for the principle of non-resistance only 60 years earlier. This transition to honoring new martyrs while neglecting the old is a succinct summary of the accommodation to German nationalism on the part of some Prussian Mennonites in the second half of the 19th century. Yet other Mennonites strove to maintain the traditional relationships, the traditional understandings. The leading proponent to avoid military service, even after the draft was imposed in 1867, was Elder Gerhard Penner of the Heubuden Mennonite Church. He could see the castle from his church. This is the largest Mennonite congregation in the Vistula Delta, and he and many other church leaders wrote petitions to the Prussian king, William I, and to many other officials asking for the restoration of their exemption. They sent a delegation of 5 elders in October of 1867 to Berlin to press their case, and they met there with the king and the crown prince and a lot of other officials, and with the minister of war, Albrecht von Roon. Roon probably talked to them the longest out of all the politicians they met with. He urged them to just accept service as medics in the military. What's so wrong with that? And they asked, one of the elders, Peter Bartle, from the congregation in Gruppa, asked if the medics would have to wear sidearms. Roon said, yes, they would. And the elder said, well, no, we can't do that. That's a violation of our beliefs. And that led Roon to ask him, now, what are your beliefs? They had a long conversation about Mennonite beliefs. At the very end of that, Albert von Roon grabbed the coat lapel of Peter Bartle and said, I carry arms in war. Do you think it's possible for me to be saved? What would we say to David McGuinty, Minister of National Defense, if he was here today pulling on Paul's arm, asking that question? The elders quoted Apostle Paul's advice to the Corinthians, that some can eat meat offered to idols while others cannot. So what is allowed for the one is not allowed for the other, and Roon would have a clear path to heaven. In March 1868, Mennonites were given permission by the king to serve as non-combatants, but could not avoid the obligation to carry arms and to fight under certain conditions. Penner's own position remained the traditional one, that a Mennonite who agreed to serve in the military had decided to stop being a Mennonite. Most of the leadership of Heubuden agreed with him and prepared to immigrate to the United States. Some leaders and members in other congregations migrated to the Russian Empire, while most leaders and the majority of Mennonite laity decided to stay in Germany and accept military service. One Heubuden member who tested the government's limits on this was Johann Dick, who was sent a draft notice. He was sent a draft notice in April of 1872. He went into hiding. But he was quickly found by the military, who took him to the Marienburg train station. He refused to accept the train ticket they gave him to go to Berlin, where he was supposed to be stationed. So the next day, he's put on the train and transported there under guard. Once he got there, he refused to put on his uniform. So they put the uniform on him by force. Then he refused to swear an oath of induction and loyalty to the emperor, even in an alternative form of affirmation which had been approved specifically for Mennonites already back in 1827. For this refusal, he was sentenced to several days in confinement. Upon release, he was asked, are you ready to swear now or to affirm now? He refused. He's given a week in confinement, the maximum penalty. This cycle repeated weekly for months. Elder Penner visited him in prison in Berlin in November, and he was apparently released soon after, ostensibly for reasons of health. His suffering for his faith, however, was discounted by other Mennonites in Prussia at the time and remains largely unknown to Mennonites today. Another congregant of Elder Penner, Bernhard Fieguth, he tried a different path. He volunteered for regular military service in 1873 and was banned by Elder Penner for this transgression. On June 7 of 1874, Fieguth appeared at church for communion. Fieguth's father had been telling people that Penner was going to give his son communion or face legal penalties because the government had decided to no longer tolerate the use of church discipline against Mennonite soldiers. Elder Penner's son Heinrich stopped Bernhard on the church doorsteps and asked him, do you really think you're going to try to get communion today? Bernhard told him, I am determined to see if I can get communion or not. Elder Penner refused him and was brought up on charges by the government the following week. He and his followers soon migrated to the United States. Now, these two young men from the same congregation document in one way the different ideals of martyrdom that were circulating among Mennonites in Prussia in the late 19th century. Fieguth's model was clearly ascendant. After 1880, while some Mennonites would still prefer the option of not serving, all were willing to serve at least as non-combatants if drafted. After the turn of the century, the new positive attitude toward military service in the German Empire was expressed in the only monument Mennonites ever built along the Vistula River. The story of Abraham Nickel visiting with King Frederick William III to announce a patriotic gift had been kept alive in German culture in various short story collections, readers, or Lesebücher, that gathered texts used to teach reading, and in the 19th century to inculcate patriotism for the German cause. The version of the story in these books came from a bishop, Ruleman Friedrich Eilert. He had been an advisor to the king and had written a favorable biography. It was really a hagiography of the king. He added embellishments that are not in Mennonite or archival sources that included Abraham's wife, Sarah Nickel, bringing a basket of butter for the queen, Louisa, a type of womanly gift to parallel the masculine gift of money for guns. The title given to the short story was A German Farmer, and it presented the Mennonites as simple-minded, loyal, patriotic Germans. In 1906, the centennial of this original encounter, a newspaper article in Mennonische Blätter recounted the story, and eventually a committee was formed, and this monument was created to commemorate Abraham Nickel's patriotic gift. As you can see, no mention is made of the clear intent for this gift to preserve Mennonites' military exemption, since they had given that up decades ago. While the original donors meant patriotic in a way that provided political cover while they avoided military service, a century later, Mennonites were genuinely patriotic and grateful for the many opportunities that they now had as full German citizens. Young Mennonites could study at the universities, they could buy farmland, they could run businesses, all without restriction. They contributed with satisfaction to a growing German empire, and they now recast their ascendants as early patriots and admonished their young people to stay this course. And stay the course they did. When World War I started, roughly 2/3 of all Mennonite draftees served as regular soldiers, while only 1/3 asked to serve as non-combatants. That ratio shifted to more regular German Mennonite soldiers as the war continued. By the end of the war, 400 German Mennonite men died in the war, about 2%, or 1 out of every 50 Mennonites. No one thought of these soldiers as martyrs, of course, but they were the dead who were now commemorated. Originally, memorializing war dead had been the purview of kings and the nobility, who were the commanders and the officers. But with the spread of the draft and the ideology of nationalism, the people were seen and saw themselves as sovereigns, responsible to lead and to defend their own. The inclusion of ordinary soldiers in village and church memorials began in larger scale with the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, but exploded with World War I. Now Mennonites were part of the German nation, both in the way they died and in the way they commemorated their dead. Their dead were no longer set apart as those killed for their faith by their neighbors and their government, but rather as those who belonged both to the congregation and the nation. The saddest entry for me on these tablets from the Weierhof Mennonite Church in the Palatinate is one for a 19-year-old Johannes Herzler. Anybody in here 19 years old? Yeah, this is you. If you look at the dates, maybe you can't see him. He died on October 21, 1918, a few weeks before the armistice on November 11. His 20th birthday was November 8. Now, Benedict Anderson, historian of nationalism, has talked about how the rise of nationalism created tombs of unknown soldiers, like the Canadian tomb in Ottawa, as sacred sites in many nations, a place and a way to be assured that the dead live on in some fashion, a notion that supplants Christian understandings of the connection between death and eternal life. For Mennonites, at least, imagining this new type of connection to an eternal nation meant that old martyrs had indeed been traded for new.
Thank you very much for a very fine lecture. Let me just remind you, we've been live streaming and these lectures, and they will also be posted on our website if you want to access them or inform somebody. We now have a bit of time for conversation, and you'll see that we have some microphones in the aisles. So if you have a brief question, we'd ask you to come to one of the microphones, kindly introduce yourself, and then address your question to Professor Jansen, who will field the questions here on his own. So please, let's take this opportunity.
Yes, my name is Peter Rempel. Just while we have this up on the page, what the Weierhof Mennonite Church has done with this plaque is moved it so that it's leaning against the side of the cemetery, and they replaced it with Declaration for Pacifism. So that's the most recent thing with this. Two questions of terminology that may shed more light. One is, Mannhardt's book was published by die Altpreußischen Mennoniten. Mm-hmm. What were they trying to say by saying we are the old Prussian Mennonites? And then the other is, you've talked about citizens, but at some point, up to a certain point, these people were subjects of a king, not citizens of a state. And that transition must have been in the background to deliberations.
Yeah, great, good questions. So on the terminology of old Prussians, it's not that the people were old, but the term itself changed over time. So the original meaning of Prussia is a geographic designation of an area that on the map earlier showed as West Prussia and East Prussia. So that's Prussia. And then well, get all the terminology in there. The Elector of Brandenburg, actually this first guy who invited the Mennonites to Ducal Prussia, his title was Frederick III, Elector of Brandenburg. And anybody in here want to be an elector? Like, that's not very exciting. Who wants to be a king? He wanted to be a king. So when he went to Ducal Prussia, because it was outside the Holy Roman Empire, he could call himself king in Prussia. It's kind of like, I don't know, what would a good analogy be? You know, you go to Steinbach and you can be the king of Winnipeg, but when you come back to Winnipeg, you're like, well, somebody else will object. Maybe the mayor doesn't like that. So he got King of Prussia in his title, and that eventually became the name of the entire state of Prussia, which grew to be ginormous. So then it was confusing. When you're talking about Prussia, do you mean the geographic area, or do you mean the large, powerful state? And the shorthand that developed then in the 19th century at the end of these developments was to call the original, meaning they could have said original Prussia, they just said Old Prussia. So that's why it's Old Prussia. And that's why the English translation of the book title is In Provincial Prussia. That gives the sense of it. Now, this question about subjects and citizens is a really big question, and I'm trying to give just a really short answer. And the short answer is they're subjects of a Prussian king as long as there's no constitution and no expectations of rights. Those expectations of rights start to come in some places in Germany already with the French Revolution in the West. The conversation gets everywhere after the revolutions of 1848, and they do get a kind of a constitution in 1850. And so from 1850 on, people can talk of themselves as Prussian citizens who are still subjects of the king, but they have a parliament and they have some say. It's really complicated, but that's kind of the shorthand.
Hello, my name is Beck Conrad. I'm a third-year theology student here. I have a small question about Abraham Nicol and his wife Sarah Nicol. You talked about how they were embellished to be like patriotic heroes. Was his wife's name actually Sarah, or was that an intentional move to try and relate them to like Abraham and Sarah from the Bible?
That's a great question. You know, like if your name's Abraham, you have to marry Sarah, right? Like, what choice do you have? You know, I wondered about that while I was working on this, and the honest answer is I don't know. So yeah, I'll put that on my list of homework, and we need to figure that out. I think there's no doubt he was married. It's possible that the story is true. And I'll tell you, one of the problems is both Mennonite sources from this time period and government sources from this time period are resolute in their refusal to ever mention women by name. So there's another really famous case of a woman who, well, it's a long story, but like there was this really marriage that fell apart badly and impacted these things, and you could not find, there was a lawsuit that lasted for years, went to the highest court in the land, the woman's at the center of it, and her name is nowhere in any court record, in any Mennonite record, but if you get the husband's name and you go to the genealogy, you could find the woman's name. And I haven't done that yet for Abraham Nicol. I'm not sure we have him in our genealogy table, so yeah, Conrad, maybe we have to get on this and get this figured out. It's a great question, and we just don't know. It could be true, maybe she did really show up with a basket of butter, or it could be made up. So one of the fun things about history is you're never quite, sometimes you're more sure than other times, let's just say it that way. Yeah.
Hello, Mark. I'm wondering if you could paint a picture for us of who these Mennonite young men who were impressed or kept away because of the tax, who they were in terms of their age range. Would it also have been their fathers who would have been affected? Would the young men have paid individual taxes? Was it a parent who paid for them? Will you just give me a picture? And was there anything to do with the amount of land you held that affected the amount you paid, or anything like that? Just curious how that all worked.
Sure. No, good question. So I'm gonna break it kind of into two parts because the impressment piece, that story only happened in Ducal Prussia and kind of that one time, and this was the common recruiting method for the Prussian military. They would just go into villages and grab young men and force them to fight. And I don't know, the records are not real extensive, but there's no sense that there was anything about those particular guys that made them stand out. One theory was that they were looking for really tall soldiers because this guy had an obsession with tall soldiers and had a special ceremonial unit, maybe. Once we get to 1773 and this communal tax, it didn't matter who you were as a Mennonite. Like any Mennonite young man, when any question came up, had to go to their elder, and the elder had to say to the military recruiter, he's one of mine. So it was really communal and controlled by church leadership. So it didn't matter if you were rich or poor, mattered how much you paid into the communal tax, but it was all communal, so it didn't matter. And this is one of those changes that happens when you go from being a subject to a citizen. When you're a subject to the Prussian king and the Prussian king has this deal, it applies to everybody in that category. When you're a citizen, nobody asks when you're drafted, well, what does your pastor think? What does your father think? You have a direct tie to the state as a citizen. And so part of the development there was that now individual Mennonites had to make individual decisions, and what their community thought no longer mattered or couldn't control them. So you could say, Yahoo, that's freedom for everyone. Or you could say, wow, freedom for everyone gets problematic. I hope that. So that's a good question. They would, so if you weren't baptized and they were coming to draft you, what would happen? I think they pretty much all got baptized. It kind of put a pressure on you to, I mean, there was just pressure to conform now. That, which also has its, kind of anywhere you go, you've got some dilemmas here. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Sort of two related questions. As the nationalism that you see in the growing in the Prussian Mennonites, is that a Prussian nationalism or a German nationalism, or does that question make any sense at all? And then also, what happens to their relationships with other Mennonites across Europe and even into North America as Prussian nationalism rises? Because Martyr's Mirror is making an argument that the martyrs are part of the same movement and they're all related to each other.
Yeah, yeah. The Prussian-German nationalism question is really complex. The nationalism is kind of originally Prussian, but it's overlaid with this German nationalism. And probably the best answer I've seen is from a scholar named Abigail Green, that Prussian nationalism ties you to your homeland, to your immediate territory, but it meshes kind of automatically and without much tension with the larger. So you could kind of ask, well, are you Manitobans? Are you Canadians? There's some difference there, but yeah. So basically, it doesn't matter, but it is complex. And the short answer to Prussians and others is elsewhere where Mennonites wanted to keep a distance from military service, those ties were challenged. And the one single point I would look at is, I think, it was in 1895 that the Prussians wrote a unified confession of faith that allowed for military service. And then the following year, 1896, Russian Mennonites adopted that confession and tweaked that paragraph because they didn't agree with it. And you can just follow that really everywhere else. So it introduces fractures and divisions among Mennonites over this issue. In North America, they tended, of course, to still want to keep that. So they're like, we're not sure about you. Yeah.
All right, thanks again. I want to warmly welcome you to return here tonight at 7 o'clock, where the title of the lecture is, Are We All Finally Polish? So please join me in thanking Mark once more for his good work here. I wish you a good afternoon. God bless you all.